Think ancient Egypt was all about pyramids and gold. Think Cleopatra and pharaohs living in luxury. Well, buckle up, because you're about to discover a side of Egyptian religion so dark that it makes modern cults look tame. We're talking about a civilization that turned young women into human sacrifices, not through quick deaths, but through something far more cruel: living burials in golden cages. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth that Egyptologists spent decades trying to downplay. In the earliest dynasties of Egypt, around 3100 BCE, when a king died, he didn't go to the afterlife alone. Archaeological excavations at Abydos in the 1990s revealed something that sent shockwaves through the academic world. Surrounding the royal tombs of Egypt's first rulers, archaeologists found hundreds of subsidiary burials. Young servants, officials, and especially young women, all buried at approximately the same time as their king. These weren't people who happened to die of natural causes. The skeletal remains showed individuals in their teens and 20s, physically healthy, with no signs of disease. They were killed, and the evidence suggests many were buried alive, sealed into chambers around their master's tomb, to serve him in the afterlife. David O'Connor, one of the lead archaeologists, documented roughly 600 retainer sacrifices around just one First Dynasty tomb. 600 lives, most of them young, most of them female, extinguished to accommodate one dead king's journey to eternity. But here's where the story gets even more disturbing. As Egyptian civilization became more sophisticated, they didn't abandon the practice of sacrificing young women to religious fanaticism. They just made it more socially acceptable. They created a system where the sacrifice wasn't quick, it was lifelong. Welcome to the institution of the god's wife of Amun. Starting around 1085 BCE, during Egypt's third intermediate period, the highest religious position a woman could hold wasn't an honor, it was a trap. The god's wife of Amun was theoretically one of the most powerful positions in Egypt. These women controlled vast temple estates, commanded armies of priests, and wielded political influence that rivaled pharaohs themselves. Sounds amazing, right? Except for one small detail. To accept this position meant taking a perpetual vow of celibacy. No marriage, no children, no sexual relationships of any kind, ever. And this wasn't a choice made by mature women who felt called to religious service. These were little girls, sometimes as young as 6 or 7 years old, adopted into the position and immediately isolated from normal life. The system was brilliantly cruel in its design. Egyptian kings would force their daughters or nieces into these positions to consolidate political power. By making a royal princess the god's wife, the king ensured that temple wealth stayed within royal control. But that princess paid the price. From childhood, she was trained for a life of absolute isolation, taught that her body was too sacred for any man to touch, that her purpose was to remain forever virgin, forever alone, forever the symbolic bride of a god who would never actually appear. Historical records make clear this wasn't voluntary. Inscriptions at Karnak Temple document how these positions were filled through forced adoption. A reigning god's wife would adopt her successor, usually a young princess, and the girl had no say in the matter. The adoption ceremony was legally binding. Once adopted, the girl belonged to the temple. Her family couldn't reclaim her, she couldn't refuse, she couldn't escape. But here's what makes this system particularly insidious compared to the quick deaths of those First Dynasty retainers. At least those sacrificial victims didn't have to live with their fate for decades. The gods' wives faced something arguably worse: a lifetime watching other women marry, have children, experience love and intimacy, while they remained locked in temple compounds, their youth and fertility deliberately wasted in service to political power, disguised as religious devotion. The evidence suggests these women died younger than their non-celibate counterparts. Multiple mummies of gods' wives and high-ranking priestesses, discovered in the Deir el-Bahari royal cache in 1881, show death in their 20s and 30s, unusual for women of their elite status, who should have had access to the best food and medical care available. Modern Egyptologists examining these remains find women who should have lived into their 50s or 60s dying decades early, and the system was designed to perpetuate itself. Each god's wife, trapped in her own living tomb of celibacy and isolation, would eventually adopt another young girl to replace her, ensuring the cycle of sacrifice continued generation after generation. These women became complicit in their own oppression, forced to trap the next victim, just as they had been trapped. But the true horror of this system isn't just what it did to individual women. It's what it reveals about how religious fanaticism, when combined with political power, can transform privilege into prison and turn supposed honor into lifelong torture. These women were told they were blessed, chosen by the gods, elevated above ordinary women. In reality, they were human sacrifices on an installment plan, dying slowly over decades instead of quickly in a tomb. And we're just getting started. Because while the God's wife system represents the institutionalized sacrifice of elite women, individual cases reveal horrors that make the system's cruelty even more personal, more devastating, and more impossible to look away from. Let's talk about what it actually meant to be chosen for this sacred honor. Because the selection process for becoming a god's wife of Amun wasn't some spiritual calling or divine revelation. It was a political transaction where the merchandise happened to be a child. Take Amenirtis Y, daughter of King Kashta of Kush. Around 740 BCE, when she was approximately 8 years old, her father made a calculated political move. He forced the reigning god's wife, Shepenwepet, to adopt Amenirtis as her successor. This wasn't a request. This was a power play. Kashta was conquering Egypt, and making his daughter the god's wife was how he legitimized his rule and seized control of the massive wealth controlled by Amun's temples. But let's think about what this meant for 8-year-old Amenirtis. One day she's a princess with a normal childhood ahead of her, potential marriages to forge alliances, maybe even some choice in her future. The next day, she's been given away to a religious institution, promised in perpetual virginity to a god, told her life will be spent in service and isolation. She had no say. Her mother had no say. Even Shepenwepet Afai, the woman being forced to adopt her, had no real choice in the matter. The adoption ceremony itself was designed to be psychologically devastating. Inscriptions describe how the young girl would be brought before the existing god's wife in front of assembled priests and nobles. The child would be ritually cleansed, stripped of her previous identity, and given new titles that emphasized her transformation from person to property. She was no longer Princess Amenirtis. She was now the adopted one, the future god's wife, the virgin bride of Amun. And here's where the isolation really began. These girls weren't allowed to remain with their families during their training. They were immediately moved into the temple complex at Karnak, into quarters specifically designed for the gods' wives. These weren't cozy rooms. They were elaborately decorated prisons. Yes, the walls were covered in gold and precious stones. Yes, servants attended to every need. But the doors were watched, the movements were monitored, and the message was clear. You belong to the temple now. The training program these children underwent was essentially indoctrination designed to break any resistance. From age 8 or 9, they were taught elaborate religious rituals, trained in the performance of sacred dances and hymns, and most importantly, constantly reminded of the absolute necessity of their perpetual virginity. Priests would drill into these young girls that their bodies were sacred vessels, that any sexual contact would defile them, destroy their power, and bring catastrophe to Egypt itself. Think about the psychological manipulation involved here. You're taking prepubescent girls and teaching them that their developing bodies are simultaneously sacred and dangerous, that their natural sexual development is a threat to cosmic order, that any normal human desire they might feel is evil and destructive. This wasn't education. This was systematic psychological abuse designed to ensure these women would police their own imprisonment. The isolation intensified as they grew older. While other Egyptian girls their age were learning to manage households, meeting potential husbands, Starting to understand their roles as future wives and mothers, these chosen girls watched from behind temple walls. They could see normal life happening outside their compound, but they could never participate in it. They were observers of the humanity they'd been forbidden to experience. Historical records give us glimpses of just how complete this isolation was. God's wives had their own staff, but these servants were specifically chosen from among older women or eunuchs, people who posed no potential for romantic or sexual contact. Even the priests who worked closest with them maintained strict physical distance. The God's wife existed in a bubble of enforced celibacy that touched everyone around her. And the cruelest part? These girls were old enough to understand what was being taken from them, but too young to have any power to resist. Amanirdis. I was adopted at 8. By the time she was 13 or 14, old enough to truly comprehend what a lifetime of celibacy meant, she'd already been in the system for years. She'd been so thoroughly indoctrinated that escape wasn't just impossible, it was probably unthinkable. The system also ensured that even if a God's wife wanted to rebel, she had nowhere to go. Her family couldn't take her back without risking religious and political catastrophe. She had no husband to protect her, no children to support her in old age. The temple was her only security. The same institution that imprisoned her was also her only source of survival. But here's something that makes this even more disturbing. The political nature of these adoptions meant that these girls often barely knew the woman who was adopting them. Shepenwepet Iu and Amanirdis, I came from rival kingdoms. They weren't family, they weren't friends. Shepenwepet was being forced to accept her eventual replacement, and Amanirdis was being forced into a life sentence with a stranger as her only maternal figure. The elaborate ceremonies and golden quarters couldn't hide the reality. These weren't princesses being elevated to sacred status. These were children being sold into institutionalized celibacy, their reproductive futures sacrificed on the altar of political power, their natural human development deliberately stunted in service to a system that viewed their bodies as tools rather than their own property. And once the adoption was complete, once the ceremonies were performed and the vows were taken, there was no escape clause. No changing your mind at 18. No deciding at 25 that maybe this wasn't the life you wanted. The decision made for you as a child became your prison for life. But some of these women, trapped in their golden cages, would leave behind evidence of just how much that imprisonment cost them. Evidence that modern science would eventually uncover, revealing the quiet desperation of lives that were never supposed to be lived. Around the year 1000 BCE, a woman named Matkare Mutamhat held more political and economic power than almost anyone else in Egypt. She controlled vast temple estates that generated enormous wealth. She commanded thousands of priests and temple workers. She performed rituals that Egyptians believed maintained cosmic order itself. Foreign ambassadors had to negotiate with her to access Egyptian resources. In practical terms, Matkare was more powerful than many pharaohs of her era. She was also completely, utterly alone. Matkare served as God's wife of Amun for approximately 24 years, from around 1000 to 976 BCE. Historical inscriptions describe her authority, her management of temple affairs, her performance of sacred rituals. But they don't talk about what it cost her. For that evidence, we have to look at her mummy, discovered in 1881 in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, and what archaeologists found buried with her. When Egyptologists first examined Matkare's mummy in the late 19th century, they made a shocking discovery. Wrapped carefully beside her body was what appeared to be a tiny, mummified infant. The immediate interpretation seemed obvious and scandalous. Matkare, the god's wife, who had taken sacred vows of perpetual virginity, had apparently broken those vows. She'd gotten pregnant. The baby had died, and she'd been buried with it, her secret preserved for 3,000 years. This interpretation dominated Egyptology for decades. Here was proof, scholars said, that even the most sacred vows couldn't suppress human nature. Matkare had lived her double life, maintaining public celibacy while privately experiencing motherhood, only to lose the child and take her secret to the grave. But in 1968, the Egyptian Museum finally conducted X-ray analysis of the small mummy bundle. And what they discovered was somehow even more heartbreaking than the original interpretation. It wasn't a baby. It was a hamadryas baboon, a young one, carefully mummified and wrapped in the same elaborate style used for human infants. Think about what this means. Mayat-Kare, one of the most powerful women in the ancient world, denied any possibility of marriage or children by her sacred vows, had kept a baby baboon. She had cared for this animal, probably raised it from infancy, treated it with enough affection that when it died, she wanted it buried with her for eternity. The baboon wasn't just a pet. The elaborate mummification, the infant-style wrapping, the placement in her tomb, all of it suggests that this animal had become a substitute for the children she would never be allowed to have. Modern primatologists confirm that young baboons, especially when hand-raised, bond intensely with their caregivers and can display behaviors remarkably similar to human infants. They need constant attention, physical contact, care, and feeding. For a woman forbidden to mother human children, a baby baboon might have been the only living thing she was allowed to nurture. But here's what makes this discovery so devastating. Mayat-Kare couldn't just openly say, "I'm lonely, I want something to care for." She had to maintain the fiction of being above such human needs. The baboon had to be framed as a sacred animal, a religious symbol, anything but what it actually was. Evidence of a powerful woman's desperate attempt to fill the emotional void created by her forced celibacy, and she wasn't alone in this quiet desperation. Analysis of other gods' wives' tombs reveals similar patterns, elaborate collections of cosmetics they were forbidden to use to attract partners, jewelry that no one but servants and priests would ever see them wear, personal items that suggest private lives of profound isolation despite public power. The political reality of Mayat-Kare's position makes her situation even more cruel. As God's wife of Amun during the 21st dynasty, she lived through a period of political fragmentation. Egypt was effectively split between north and south, with weak pharaohs in the north and the high priests of Amun, effectively her colleagues, controlling the south. Mayat-Kare's position gave her real administrative power. She wasn't a figurehead. She made actual decisions that affected thousands of people's lives. But all that power was contingent on her continued virginity. If there had been any scandal, any suggestion that she'd broken her vows, her political enemies would have used it to strip her of authority, possibly even execute her. The baboon incident shows how careful she had to be. Even her attempt to have something to love had to be disguised in religious symbolism. We know from temple inscriptions that Mayat-Kare performed rituals meant to ensure fertility for Egypt's women, to bless marriages, to protect pregnant women and newborns. Imagine the psychological torture of spending your days performing rituals to grant other women the very things you've been forbidden to experience yourself. Every blessing she gave for a successful pregnancy was a reminder of the children she would never carry. Every marriage ceremony she witnessed reinforced her own perpetual solitude. The analysis of Mayat-Kare's mummy suggests she died in her 40s, relatively young for someone of her elite status, with access to excellent nutrition and medical care. The cause of death isn't conclusive, but modern Egyptologists note that chronic stress, the kind created by decades of enforced isolation and suppressed human needs, takes a severe physical toll. Some scholars speculate that the psychological cost of her position may have contributed to premature aging and death. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Mayat-Kare's story is what happened after she died. The next god's wife, chosen to replace her, would have seen Mayat-Kare's tomb, would have known about the baboon buried as a substitute child. And yet, the system continued. The new god's wife took the same vows, accepted the same isolation, prepared to live the same lonely existence. Because by that point, the women in these positions had become so invested in the system that imprisoned them, they couldn't imagine any alternative. Mayat-Kare's baboon, carefully mummified and wrapped like a human infant, preserved for 3 millennia, stands as one of the most heartbreaking archaeological discoveries in Egyptology. It's evidence of a woman who had everything except what she actually needed: the freedom to be human, to love, to be loved, to nurture and be nurtured in return. She was the most powerful woman in Egypt, and she died alone, clutching the mummified remains of an animal she'd loved because she was forbidden to love anything human. But not every woman accepted her fate as quietly as Matkare. Some tried to escape, some tried to break their vows, and the system's response to resistance reveals just how brutal this golden cage could become when its prisoners tried to break free. The God's wife system depended on one absolute rule: perpetual virginity. Break that vow, and the entire political and religious structure came crashing down, which meant that any woman who dared to resist, who tried to reclaim her humanity and her body, faced consequences that make execution look merciful. Egyptian legal texts from the New Kingdom and later periods make occasional cryptic references to priestesses who violated their vows of celibacy. The punishments described are deliberately vague, probably because the actual practices were too brutal to document in detail. But archaeological evidence and comparative analysis with other ancient cultures give us clues about what happened to women who broke the sacred rules. The standard punishment for a god's wife or high-ranking priestess caught in a sexual relationship was permanent removal from society. Not through execution, which would have been relatively quick, but through a living burial that makes their previous isolation look like freedom. These women would be stripped of their titles, their names literally chiseled off monuments and inscriptions, and confined to sealed chambers within temple complexes or remote desert locations. Think about what living burial actually meant. You're placed in a small chamber, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with minimal ventilation. Food and water are passed through a small opening. You have no human contact beyond the hands that push meals through the gap. You can't see the sky. You can't feel the sun. You live in near total darkness. The only sounds your own breathing and heartbeat, for however many years you survive. Some historical accounts suggest these punishments lasted until natural death, which could mean decades of sensory deprivation and absolute solitude. But the cruelty went beyond physical punishment. The system also destroyed these women's identities retroactively. Temple scribes would go through records and systematically erase their names. Statues would be defaced. Inscriptions would be chiseled away. The Egyptians believed that erasing someone's name destroyed their ability to exist in the afterlife. So a priestess who broke her vows didn't just lose her life, she lost her eternity. And here's where the political manipulation becomes truly insidious. Because actual violations of celibacy vows were probably rare, the accusation of breaking vows became a convenient weapon for eliminating politically inconvenient women. If a faction wanted to remove a god's wife who supported their rivals, all they needed was a plausible accusation. The woman's denial wouldn't matter. Her actual innocence wouldn't matter. The accusation itself was enough to destroy her. We have fragmentary evidence of at least 2 cases from the Third Intermediate Period where God's wives or their designated successors mysteriously disappeared from historical records with no explanation. One day they're mentioned in inscriptions and temple documents. The next, nothing. Their names stop appearing. Their planned construction projects are reassigned to others. It's as if they never existed. The most likely explanation? They were accused of impropriety, removed from their positions, and either executed or buried alive, with all records of their existence systematically destroyed. The gaps in the historical record aren't accidents. They're evidence of deliberate erasure. But accusations didn't just target the women themselves. The system also destroyed anyone associated with alleged violations. If a priestess was accused of breaking her vows with a specific man, that man, and often his entire family, would be executed. Servants who might have facilitated the relationship, or even just failed to report suspicious behavior, faced severe punishment. The message was clear. Everyone around a god's wife was responsible for policing her body and her behavior. This created a surveillance state within the temple complexes. God's wives couldn't trust their own servants, who might report innocent interactions to protect themselves. They couldn't confide in other priestesses, who might use accusations as political weapons. They lived in constant awareness that any action, any word, any look could be misinterpreted as evidence of breaking their vows. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance was devastating. Modern psychological studies of people living under total surveillance show patterns of anxiety, paranoia, and emotional shutdown. The gods' wives weren't just isolated from normal human contact, they were also denied the possibility of trust or genuine connection with anyone around them. Some women tried to navigate the system by forming carefully calibrated relationships with trusted servants or fellow priestesses, connections that provided some emotional support without crossing the lines that would trigger accusations. But even these relationships were dangerous. Egyptian literature from the period includes warnings about the dangers of female friendship, suggesting that even non-sexual emotional intimacy between women in religious service was viewed with suspicion. The cruelest aspect of this surveillance system was how it turned the victims into perpetrators. As we discussed with Matkari, each god's wife was eventually responsible for adopting and training her successor, which meant that these women, who had suffered under the system themselves, were forced to prepare the next generation for the same suffering. They had to teach young girls to suppress their humanity, to view their bodies as dangerous, to accept isolation as sacred duty. Some gods' wives tried to make the system slightly more bearable for their successors. There's evidence that some used their political power to improve living conditions in the temple complexes, to ensure their adopted daughters had access to education and stimulation beyond pure religious training. But these small mercies couldn't change the fundamental reality. They were still trapping another human being in a lifetime of forced celibacy and isolation. The historical record also hints at suicide among priestesses in these positions, though Egyptian religious beliefs made suicide so taboo that it's rarely explicitly documented. But there are cases of priestesses who died young under mysterious circumstances, described vaguely as taken by the gods or called to eternal service. Some scholars believe these euphemisms masked suicides, women who found their golden cages so unbearable that death seemed like the only escape. And throughout all of this, the system continued to present these positions as honors, as sacred privileges. Temple propaganda described God's wives as blessed, chosen, elevated above ordinary women. The reality of psychological torture, constant surveillance, and perpetual isolation was hidden behind elaborate rituals and golden ornaments. But the human body, even when the mind has been successfully indoctrinated, tells its own truth. And when modern science finally got access to the mummies of these supposedly blessed women, what they discovered revealed the physical cost of decades spent in sacred imprisonment. In 1881, when archaeologists discovered the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, containing over 50 mummies of Egypt's elite, they thought they'd found perfectly preserved examples of ancient Egyptian royalty and high-ranking officials. And they had. But what they didn't realize at the time was that these mummies would eventually reveal uncomfortable truths about the cost of sacred service. Truths that the ancient Egyptians had tried to hide behind elaborate funerary practices and religious propaganda. Let's talk about Henuttawi, also known as Henuttawi C, to distinguish her from other women with the same name. She served as a chantress of Amun during the 21st dynasty, around 1070 BCE. Chantress was a high-ranking priestly position that, like God's wife of Amun, required celibacy and temple isolation. Her mummy was among those discovered in the Deir el-Bahari cache, elaborately wrapped and placed in a beautifully decorated coffin that indicated her elite status. When Egyptologists first unwrapped Henuttawi's mummy in the early 20th century, they noted she'd received expensive mummification treatment reserved for the highest social classes. Her organs had been carefully removed and preserved. Her body had been packed with linen and resin to maintain its shape. Everything about her burial suggested she'd been honored and valued by Egyptian society. But modern analysis tells a different story. CT scans conducted in the 2000s as part of the Egyptian Mummy Project revealed that Henuttawi died in her mid to late 20s. For a woman of her elite status, With access to the best food and medical care available in ancient Egypt, this was shockingly young. Common Egyptian women of lower status regularly lived into their 40s and 50s. Wealthy women often reached their 60s or beyond. Yet Henutawi, who should have had every advantage, was dead before 30. The CT scans couldn't determine an exact cause of death, which itself is telling. There was no evidence of infectious disease, no signs of cancer or other obvious pathology, no traumatic injury. Henutawi's body simply failed. Modern medical experts examining the scans have suggested that chronic stress, the kind produced by years of psychological isolation and suppressed emotional needs, can cause early death even in otherwise healthy individuals. The body keeps score, even when the mind has been trained to deny its suffering. And Henutawi wasn't an isolated case. When researchers analyzed the ages of death for women who served in high-ranking celibate religious positions, they found a consistent pattern. These women died significantly younger than their non-celibate counterparts, even when controlling for social status and access to resources. The gods' wives, the divine adoratresses, the high-ranking chantresses, they were dying in their 30s and 40s, decades before they should have. But the physical evidence reveals more than just premature death. Analysis of bone density in these mummies shows patterns consistent with chronic malnutrition, specifically lack of certain nutrients. This seems impossible given their elite status and access to temple resources, but modern medical understanding offers an explanation. Chronic depression and anxiety can suppress appetite and interfere with nutrient absorption, even when food is plentiful. These women were literally wasting away from the inside, their bodies slowly failing under the weight of decades of psychological torment. The really disturbing discoveries came from examining the burial goods included in these women's tombs. Egyptian funerary practice dictated that the dead should be buried with items they'd need in the afterlife. What you find in a tomb tells you something about how the person lived. In the tombs of married women, archaeologists typically find cosmetic items used to attract partners, jewelry worn in social settings, children's toys that belong to their offspring, objects that speak to lives filled with family and social connection. In the tombs of gods' wives and other celibate priestesses, you find something very different. Multiple gods' wives were buried with elaborate collections of cosmetics that show little to no signs of use. Expensive coal containers still full, perfume jars with seals unbroken. These weren't items they'd used in life. They were items they'd been given but forbidden to use because who were they trying to look beautiful for? They had no husbands to attract, no social events to attend outside the temple. The cosmetics were symbols of the normal female life they'd been denied. Even more heartbreaking are the dolls and small figurines found in some priestess burials. Not religious figurines, but simple toys, children's playthings. Some scholars initially interpreted these as religious objects, but closer analysis reveals they're just dolls, the kind any Egyptian child might have played with. These were women who died still clutching remnants of the childhoods that had been stolen from them when they were forced into sacred service. The tomb of one unnamed high-ranking priestess from Thebes, discovered in the 1920s, contained dozens of small carved animals, birds, cats, dogs, all carefully arranged around her sarcophagus. The excavators were puzzled by this menagerie until they realized these were probably substitutes for the pets and animal companions the priestess had kept during her lifetime. Perhaps the only living things she'd been allowed to form attachments to, much like Matkare and her baboon. Modern forensic analysis has also revealed evidence of self-harm in some of these mummies. Several show patterns of scarring on their arms and legs consistent with deliberate cutting or burning. Ancient Egyptian medical texts make occasional references to priestesses who engaged in purification through pain, which scholars now believe was actually self-mutilation, a response to the psychological trauma of their positions that was rationalized through religious language. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from the mummies' faces. Advanced 3D reconstruction technology has allowed researchers to recreate the facial features of these ancient women. And what they've found is striking. The reconstructed faces of celibate priestesses show patterns of muscle tension and stress markers that differ significantly from other mummies of similar age and status. Even in death, Their faces carry evidence of the chronic anxiety and depression they endured in life. The irony is almost unbearable. These women were given the most elaborate mummification treatments, the finest burial goods, the most prominent tombs. Egyptian society honored them in death with every material luxury. But what these women actually needed, what they'd been desperate for during their lives, wasn't gold or fine linen or elaborate rituals. It was simply the freedom to be human, to love and be loved, to live without constant surveillance and suppression of their natural emotional needs. And here's what makes this even more tragic. The Egyptians who buried these women with such care and reverence probably never realized they were entombing victims of institutional cruelty. To them, these priestesses had lived blessed lives in service to the gods. The idea that these women might have suffered, that their early deaths might have been caused by the very system that supposedly honored them, probably never occurred to the priests and officials who arranged their elaborate funerals. But the bodies don't lie. The bones, the organs, the burial goods, the faces frozen in eternal rest, all of it tells the same story. These women paid a devastating physical price for their sacred service. Their bodies became battlegrounds between biological needs and religious demands, and eventually, the bodies lost. Yet even death didn't end the story of these sacrificial victims, because the system that consumed them continued operating for centuries more, claiming new victims, perpetuating the cycle of suffering disguised as honor. Until finally, external forces brought it crashing down in ways the Egyptians never anticipated. For over 500 years, from roughly 1085 BCE to 5225 BCE, the system of God's wives of Amun operated with brutal efficiency. Generations of young women were fed into this machine of institutionalized celibacy and isolation. The system seemed permanent, unchangeable, as eternal as the temples themselves. And then, in 525 BCE, it ended. Not through internal reform or growing consciousness of its cruelty, but through invasion and conquest. The last confirmed God's wife of Amun was Ankh-Neferibray, daughter of Pharaoh Psamtik II. She held the position from approximately 586 to 525 BCE, serving for over 60 years. By all accounts, she was politically astute, managed temple estates efficiently, and maintained the traditions of her office with dedication. She was also the woman who would witness the complete destruction of everything the gods' wives represented. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt with overwhelming military force. The Egyptian armies, weakened by decades of internal political fragmentation, couldn't stop him. Cambyses swept through the country, crushing resistance, and specifically targeted Egypt's religious institutions. He understood that Egyptian power wasn't just military or political, it was religious. Control the temples, control Egypt. Ankh-Neferibray was in her 80s by this point, having spent her entire adult life in service to Amun. Historical records become fragmentary here, but we know that Cambyses ordered the temples of Amun stripped of their wealth and authority. The position of God's wife, which had wielded enormous political and economic power, was abolished. The system that had consumed young women for 5 centuries ended not because anyone recognized its cruelty, but because a foreign conqueror found it politically inconvenient. What happened to Ankh-Neferibray herself is unclear. Some historians suggest she died shortly before or during the invasion. Others believe she may have lived several more years in obscurity, stripped of her titles and power, watching the temples she'd served for over 60 years fall into Persian hands. Either way, she was the last. No successor was adopted. No young girl was forced into the golden cage to replace her. The machine simply stopped. But the Persian conquest didn't just end the God's wife system. It revealed something crucial about what that system had actually been. Once Egyptian political independence was lost, there was no need to continue the practice of forcing royal women into celibate religious service. The whole elaborate structure of sacred virginity and divine marriage had been nothing more than a political tool, a way for Egyptian dynasties to control temple wealth and maintain power. The religious justifications, the claims of cosmic necessity, the insistence that these women's sacrifice maintained universal order, All of it was propaganda designed to mask political calculation. Modern archaeology has uncovered evidence that, in the decades following the Persian conquest, former priestesses who had been bound by celibacy vows were quietly released from their obligations. Some married, some simply disappeared into private life. The gods didn't strike them down. Egypt didn't collapse into chaos. The cosmic order remained intact. Turns out perpetual virginity wasn't actually necessary for maintaining the universe after all. The archaeological record from the late period and Ptolemaic era shows a dramatic shift in how religious positions for women were structured. Priestess roles still existed, but they no longer required lifelong celibacy or childhood adoption. Women could serve in temples and also marry, have children, live normal lives. The idea that female religious service required complete suppression of sexuality and family life simply vanished once the political motivations behind it were gone. In 2010, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo launched a comprehensive project to re-examine and reanalyze the mummies of women who had served in high religious positions. Using modern CT scanning, DNA analysis, and forensic reconstruction, researchers began documenting the physical and psychological costs these women had paid. The project was controversial. Some Egyptian officials worried it would cast ancient Egyptian religion in a negative light. But the scientists persisted. What they found confirmed the patterns we've discussed: premature death, signs of chronic stress, evidence of psychological trauma. The physical remains told stories that temple inscriptions and religious texts had carefully hidden. These weren't blessed women living in divine harmony. These were victims of a system that sacrificed human well-being for political power. The museum now includes more honest context in displays featuring gods' wives and other celibate priestesses. Visitors learn not just about these women's political power and religious importance, but also about the personal costs they paid. It's a small acknowledgement thousands of years late that something was deeply wrong with the system. But here's what's really important to understand about this history. The system of gods' wives wasn't an aberration or a unique Egyptian cruelty. It was a particularly well-documented example of a pattern that appears across human cultures and throughout history. When religious authority and political power become intertwined, when institutions need to control wealth and maintain hierarchy, women's bodies and lives become tools, instruments to be manipulated for larger political purposes. The specific forms vary. Ancient Rome had Vestal virgins, also selected as children, also required to maintain perpetual virginity under threat of being buried alive if they violated their vows. Medieval Christianity had forced vocations, where aristocratic families placed daughters in convents to avoid dividing inheritances, condemning young women to lives they never chose. The details differ, but the underlying pattern remains consistent. Women's autonomy, sexuality, and reproductive capacity becoming battlegrounds for political and religious control. What makes the Egyptian gods' wives particularly instructive is how well preserved the evidence is. We have the mummies, we have the tombs, we have the burial goods that reveal the gap between public honor and private suffering. We have enough documentation to reconstruct not just the system's mechanics, but its human cost. These women left their bodies as evidence, as testimony to what was done to them in the name of religious devotion and political necessity. Today, when you visit the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and stand before the mummy of Mardkare, you're looking at a woman who had more political power than most people in the ancient world. You're also looking at someone who was so desperate for emotional connection that she kept a baby baboon as a substitute child. Both things are true. The power was real. The suffering was real, and the system that created both should be remembered not as exotic ancient history, but as a warning about what happens when institutions treat human beings as instruments rather than as ends in themselves. The young women who paid the price of Egyptian religious fanaticism are still teaching us lessons, if we're willing to listen. Their mummified bodies, their abandoned dolls, their unused cosmetics, their substitute children, all of it speaks to a truth that transcends culture and era. When power structures demand that people sacrifice their humanity for abstract ideals or political convenience, When institutions claim that individual suffering is necessary for collective good, we should be deeply, profoundly suspicious. Because history shows us, over and over again, that such claims usually mask cruelty, exploitation, and the instrumentalization of the vulnerable by the powerful. The gods' wives of Amun were told they were blessed. They were given gold and titles and political authority. But what they actually got was a lifetime in a golden cage, their bodies and lives consumed by a system that valued their symbolic virginity more than their actual humanity. And they're still there, in museum collections around the world, silent witnesses to the price of fanaticism, waiting for us to finally understand what was done to them and why we should never allow it to happen again.